Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Dr. Evan Palmer, Chair of the Psychology Department. The Kazdin Lecture Series is an annual event hosted by the Psychology Department to inspire the next generation of students to pursue careers in psychology. It's named in honor of Dr. Alan E. Kazdin, who is a world-renowned behavioral psychologist and an alumnus of SJSU's undergraduate psychology program. Dr. Kazdin's career has been dedicated to advancing positive, nonviolent approaches to supporting youth with conduct problems, ranging from everyday challenging behavior to severe psychopathology. Thank you. When Dr. Kazdin, it's much better. When Dr. Kazdin began working with youth with severe conduct problems in the 1970s, they were characterized by psychiatrists and other authorities as psychopaths, morally defective, character disorder, and the like. Troubled youth were assumed to be incapable of change and destined for a life of crime or incarceration. Dr. Kazdin took what might have been considered a radical view at the time. He felt that there's no such thing as a bad child, only bad circumstances. It follows from this viewpoint that circumstances can change, and therefore so can troubled children. Dr. Kazdin went on to develop effective, positive, non-drug treatments for youth with severe behavioral problems and helped to teach those parenting techniques to thousands of families. Along the way, Dr. Kazdin amassed over 600 publications, including 51 books, was president of the American Psychological Association, and received numerous Lifetime Achievement Awards from professional and clinical psychology organizations. He's currently an emeritus research professor and Sterling Professor of Psychology and Child Psychiatry at Yale University. For this year's Kazdin speaker, we are thrilled and honored to have Dr. Phillip Hammack from UC Santa Cruz, who himself has had an incredibly distinguished and inspiring career. I would now like to invite Dr. Juan Peña to the stage. He's the coordinator of the Alan E. Kazdin Talk Series, and he'll introduce Dr. Hammack.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Dr. Palmer. I would like to introduce Dr. Phillip Hammack, who is a professor and director in the Sexual and Gender Diversity at UC Santa Cruz. Dr. Hammack holds a PhD in Human Development in Cultural Psychology. He also holds a Master's of Arts in Clinical Psychology from Loyola University, Chicago. And he has published extensively. And I believe he has over 100 academic articles, 4 books, 1 book, upcoming book, hopefully by next year. And he has published also on topics related to sexual and gender identity, intergroup contact, and quantitative and qualitative mixed methodologies, and narrative and cultural psychology. Can you please help me in welcoming Dr. Hammack to the stage?
I feel like I'm winning an award or something. Thank you, Juan. Does this go up? Can you hear me? Is this working? You want me to hold it a little? Maybe I could just hold it. What if I just held it? Oh, there we go. Now you can hear me. They say it's always, better when you're holding the mic, because this is what stand-up comedians do, so I'm going to be funnier right now. Well, thank you very much for welcoming me. It's been a great day. I really want to thank all the faculty who've been so hospitable, and the students who I really enjoyed meeting with recently. It's great to see you. And I'm really happy to share with you my recent research on sexual and gender diversity in 21st century America. This is my campus. Anybody been to Santa Cruz? Well, yeah, we're not too far, right? I was saying, I loved walking around this campus today, but, come to Santa Cruz, you got national park vibes, so, it's always a pleasure. So it's great to be here with you today. I want to begin with three personal narratives, all of whom experience attraction to multiple genders. Jay is a member of Generation X, born in the 1970s, identifies as a bisexual man. Malik is a millennial, born in the 1990s, also identifies as a bisexual man. And Sue is a member of Generation Z, born in the 2000s, identifies as pansexual. Now, since I'm going to be discussing generational identity at length in my talk today, it's probably useful just to briefly review the formal definitions of recent cohorts as provided by Pew in 2019. You might want to take a second to situate yourself within this framework, although looking out at the audience, I think a lot of you might fit in one particular generation. It's all good. A couple different generations, though, here. So let's go back to Jay. As a member of Generation X, Jay was born in the 1970s and experienced his childhood and adolescence at a time of particularly heightened stigma for gay and bisexual men. This was the AIDS era. He had access only to traditional sources of authority, for example, print media, school counselors, as he was developing an awareness of his sexual desire. There was no internet or social media at the time. Now, while he initially came out to friends as bisexual to reflect his attraction to multiple genders, he quickly realized that a bisexual identity was highly stigmatized in both straight and gay communities, and we were talking about this in the class earlier that I met with. So he ultimately pivoted to label himself as gay, and people at the time would often go, either gay or straight, even though they had a sense of bisexual identity in terms of their desires. But in midlife, Jay's immersion into social media actually prompts a renewed bisexual identification for him as he discovers communities of other bisexual men and as he is experiencing the heightened visibility around bisexual identity of the 21st century. Now let's talk about Malik for a second. As a millennial, born in the 1990s, Malik is a member of the first generation digital natives. He experienced his childhood with the internet and his early adolescence with the birth of social media. He was able to explore his desires easily online and came out as bisexual at age 18. As a young bisexual black man in the 2000s, he navigated the stigmatizing download discourse that became prominent at the time. This was a discourse that placed blame on bisexual black men for rising HIV rates in the community, so he had to navigate that discourse. He found community through a Facebook group for bisexual black men and ultimately formed a chosen family through the network to provide support and mentoring to one another and to escape the stigma from his family of origin. For millennials like Malik, exposure to new ideas and new sources of authority about sexuality and gender emerged in late adolescence and early adulthood, creating new possibilities. So earlier in the life course than for someone like Jay. But what about Sue? As a member of Generation Z, Sue experienced adolescence with the rapid expansion of social media in the 2010s. This period was characterized by a rise in non-binary thinking and transgender visibility. And this was a time of particular upending of traditional sources of authority. So things like, instead of going to things like encyclopedia, like print media, books, the bookstore, or school counselors or teachers, people like Sue and her peers, they actually looked to one another as sources of authoritative information about sexuality and gender. And they were able to do this through online technologies. So in Sue's case, it was age 11. This was far earlier than Jay or Malik. Sue discovers a label that she says best works for her. And it's not bisexual, it's pansexual. So like many in her generation, she's experiencing attraction to multiple genders, but prefers pansexual to bisexual because it signifies an explicit skepticism about the gender binary in her narrative. The label signals attraction beyond gender and an openness to trans and non-binary partners. So this is important for her to use this word instead of bisexual. So the contrast in narratives across members of different generations reveals the way in which the context of gender and sexual identity has been shifting rapidly this century. And my point here is that we engage with new ideas and we have access to new tools to make meaning of our gender and sexuality at different moments in our life course. Jay's experience of attraction to multiple genders in adolescence occurred at a time in which binary thinking about sexuality was really at a peak, and stigma towards bisexuality was pervasive, particularly for men. And he experienced the benefits of social technologies to affirm his bisexual identity in midlife. Malik's experience as a digital native allowed him to find community and support for his bisexual identity in emerging adulthood. And his experience was shaped by intersectional identities as he navigated heightened stigma for bisexual Black men. Sue's experience of adolescence was characterized by very early access to new ways of thinking about sexuality and gender, coming from her peers via social media, rather than traditional sources of authority. And so this allowed her to develop a newer identity label at a young age. So my general argument on where I have come to land here is that stories of sexual and gender identity development may diverge across generations in the timing and the nature of experience, but they share a common template anchored in the idea of authenticity, that the stories we tell are grounded in a theme of personal truth. It's a template for the life story that compels us, regardless of our age and the various other identities we hold. Now, when I talk about authenticity, we talked about this in the class earlier, I'm talking about a story, a type of story. It's not meant to suggest that there is always indeed some core, underlying, unwavering truth to our life stories, but it's a story of alignment between inner experience and external presentation or embodiment. Our ability to align how we act in the world, what we call ourselves in the world, with something that feels true on the inside. So it's about feeling and being able to tell that kind of life story. It's a story of accessibility, of expanded language beyond received binaries or categories. So in the 20th century, we're talking about gay and lesbian, maybe bisexual, but in the case of Jay, heavily stigmatized. We did not really regularly talk about non-binary gender or have quite that language, but we do today. We have this much more expansive concept of gender and sexuality. It's also, importantly, a story of heightened capacity for self-authorship, so for the ability to actually write our own stories ourselves and not just take on somebody else's template. This is my story. This is my unique story. And you know what? If the right word doesn't exist, I'm going to make it up. Make it up. Put it on a Tumblr blog. We'll come back to Tumblr in a moment. And watch as other people discover the word and say, aha, that's the word I've been looking for my whole life, which is what Sue kind of had that experience with pansexual. And importantly, as I've already suggested, it's the story in which prior sources of authority, traditional sources like doctors and school counselors and teachers and encyclopedias. Who gets to decide what goes in this encyclopedia? Contrast that to something like Wikipedia, right? Where anybody can edit it. There's still people watching, but you get the idea, right? There is a kind of upending of traditional sources of authority that has been unique to this century. And so when people go and they seek information online, in the case of Sue, potentially anyone could have put that out there, And then finally, as I've referred to Tumblr, it's a story of new cultural tools to facilitate possibilities to experience authenticity. So the idea of social technologies as cultural tools is going to be really central to my talk today. So that's kind of basically what I mean by authenticity as a story type. I want to zoom out, talking about the 21st century, of talking about things like Tumblr. It's like, okay, wait, what's going on here? When did all this happen? I just kind of want to zoom out to track the growth of opportunities to construct authenticity narratives. And so if we think about the first 15 years of the century, there's a lot of attention on the marriage equality movement. Some of you may or may not remember that. But the idea here was really like to legitimize sexual diversity by codifying marriage rights, which was achieved in 2015. And by then, we saw that 60% of the general public supported the idea. And this was a real historic shift in previous kind of cultural attitudes. Next, we saw a big rise, and I was really hoping when marriage equality was happening, I was like, oh, this is very focused on sort of gay and lesbian people. I myself am gay, so love gay people. But I was like, we need to work on trans rights and trans visibility. And so I was really, really happy to see, the big uptick in trans visibility that we saw this century, that we have seen this century. And this was pretty shortly followed by a rise in visibility for non-binary gender. I mean, a lot of times nowadays we talk as if these ideas have always been with us, but this didn't really start until not that long ago, that there was really this rise in non-binary visibility. That doesn't mean, of course, there have been experiences of non-binary gender for a very long time across many cultures with other names, but specifically talking about kind of dominant frameworks in the US, this really wasn't on the larger cultural radar until about 10 years ago. And all century, we've seen a rise in bisexual and pansexual visibility. Just a little note that, pansexual was updated in the Oxford English Dictionary in 2005 to its contemporary meaning. And we've seen upticks for asexuality, kink, and polyamory all century, so other forms of sexual diversity. But especially in the last decade, I don't actually recommend the movie Baby Girl. That's the poster up there. I don't know if anybody's seen it. It's not a good kink representation, but I'm putting it there as just a marker of like, okay, there's more and more visibility of some of these some of these forms of sexual diversity. Now, in tandem with these more supportive shifts, I'm sure you're thinking like, hey, it hasn't all been great when it comes to attitudes towards gender and sexual diversity. We've saw in complete parallel, while the marriage equality movement is happening, is back and forth, right? We had a big, what I call the traditional marriage movement. And it's not over. I don't mean to suggest an endpoint there, sorry, with it ending in 2015. There are people who are actively trying to overturn marriage equality today. The anti-trans movement, we've obviously seen that become really significant, especially more recently, and related attempts to legislate against education about sexual orientation and gender identity, as well as against drag performances in many states. And most significantly, we've seen the rise or reprise of conservative masculinity, as I'm calling it now, with such phenomena as the manosphere, which is a network of misogynistic and homophobic and transphobic websites, the emergence of explicitly chauvinist and ethnocentric organizations such as the Proud Boys, the enduring success of Trump's MAGA movement, populated by a high number of young white men, and the emergence of the tradwife movement among women who embrace and seek to amplify traditional gender roles in which women are subordinate to men and do not work. But the most important parts of the timeline, how did all this happen? How did these movements, how do people get into them? What captivates them? How do they communicate with people in some of these different movements and ideologies? The most important piece of the timeline, I would argue, is really the invention of what have been new cultural tools this century, and those are social technologies. And these are various icons that represent various applications, or some of them are social media icons that you'll probably recognize right away. Some of them are dating and hookup apps that, depending on your own identity, you may or may not recognize. But this kind of gives you a sense of what was happening, in the 21st century. And I think of this first wave, when most of these were invented, as a kind of benevolent wave, when the goal was really to connect people and it was less attention to how they were going to make money. And they actually didn't make money for quite a long time. Some of them still don't. So there were fewer barriers to access. I mean, you didn't need subscriptions, you didn't need to deal with tons of ads and that sort of thing as you do today. And also, there weren't the same kinds of algorithms that were trying to sell you things back then. It was like literally like, oh, here's all your friends, great. You know, here are their friends. Maybe you might want to be friends with them. You know, it was connecting. And so it was really, I have a piece in this later in the talk, but as you can kind of already tell, I do think there was a lot of good, or there has been a lot of good in social media and social technologies. So I'll say more about that. But certainly there was, a more malevolent wave. I am sort of, this was really a time when misinformation and disinformation began to thrive, and much of social media became heavily politicized. I put up here Truth Social, which is an explicitly partisan platform, Donald Trump's, and then the rebranding of Twitter as X, I see as also kind of part of this more malevolent wave. It's also noteworthy that two platforms that are up here that were really vital sources of connection changed dramatically. And both of them changed in response to legislation in 2018 that was intended to curb online sex trafficking. And so what I'm talking about, the two platforms I'm talking about here are Tumblr, which I already mentioned once. There was a mass exodus of users when it began to ban all kinds of queer-related content. And another one that some of you actually may be foreign to a lot of you, which is Craigslist Personals. You probably know Craigslist today from I can tell which generation you're in, right? Okay. Sorry, my generation. Craigslist has been around since the 90s. And you might think of it as where you sell your stuff or buy a car or, giving away free stuff. But in the heyday, the personal section was on fire. And what was really cool about the personal section, it may be a little too small to read up there, is that, you didn't indicate anything about your gender. Well, actually, you did about your gender, but about your sexual orientation when you went on it. So, it would say men seeking men seeking women, and women seeking women, et cetera, et cetera. That's very different from something like Grindr, which is an application that kind of assumes that you're identifying as gay or bisexual potentially, right? So sites like Craigslist Personals were actually really transformative for people with more flexible and fluid sexual desires, because they could go on without having to make a commitment to some sexual identity. And so Craigslist Personals is gone. I mean, 2018, they just decided we don't want the risk. And so those changes in Tumblr and Craigslist, when I put up this timeline, I really like to amplify because I think it's important. And I'll come back to it a little bit later in the talk. The third wave, so I mentioned the benevolent wave, the malevolent wave. Now this is kind of, I just put up Replica, which a lot of people don't know, but Replica is kind of the first original AI companion app. Nowadays it's all about, hey, who's your AI girlfriend, your AI boyfriend, Replica was way ahead of its time with that, I think in 2017, 2018. And so I got it up here around then. But then ChatGPT, people are turning to ChatGPT for friendship, companionship, advice. So I just want to note that social technologies are doing something very different now than they were when Sue was 11, and discovered pansexual on Tumblr. They are now connecting people not with other humans, but with machine analogs of persons. And so the last thing I just want us to consider before I leave this slide, and as we kind of just zoom out over the century, is that the 2010s appear to be an especially pivotal decade when we think about social technologies. And so I just think it's worthwhile to think about the age of different cohorts at this critical historical period. So boomers would have been in later midlife, Gen X in the prime of adulthood, early midlife. This is Jay, this is when Jay discovers, oh, you know what? Actually, it's okay to say I'm bisexual. Millennials are mostly in emerging adulthood, which allows people like Malik to come out as bi and maintain that identity, not feel like he has to, quote, pick a side. And then Gen Z in childhood and adolescence, and this is when people like Sue are exposed, oh my gosh, there's so many different options, right? So just kind of really think about that, and that's one of the things I want to suggest today. Again, there's a common shared experience of the opportunity to construct authenticity narratives, but it's happening at different times in the life course, and so that's going to pattern that in different ways. Okay, so with that big picture in mind, now I want to zoom in on the specific stories. So you've got the personal narratives I kind of started with to kind of maybe anchor you through this journey. You've got the zoomed out, larger context. Let's go deeper into what these specific stories of authenticity are actually about. The first story is this idea of gender as self-made, the idea that we have the capacity to actually create our own gender identities. We are not beholden to the confines of assigned sex. We are not beholden to a gender binary. Sorry, in spite of any executive orders you might have heard saying to the otherwise. No, we are not actually beholden to that. Because by what authority are you saying that? There's lots of other sources of authority that tell me that's not the case. We possess agency in how we express our gender. We express agency. And this is very interesting and important, when we talk specifically about the transgender experience, we actually talk about gender affirmation rather than transition. Transition used to be the primary language, but now we talk about affirmation because we recognize that those trans narratives tend to be ones that are characterized by this authenticity narrative. One example from my research is the story of Danny, a non-binary boy who says, when I got to high school, I started learning more about these terms that I didn't really know of, like non-binary, because I knew that I didn't feel all the way like a boy. Not all the way like a boy, right? Gender's on a spectrum. I did feel like a boy, but I didn't at the same time. When I finally cut my hair when I was around sophomore year, that's when it felt right. That's when it was like, okay, this feels a lot better. So here, it's like a young person like Danny has access to the opportunity to reflect on his inner experience. And actually, it's not fully boy. It's not non-binary. It's non-binary boy, right? So this idea of even just like creating new pathways when maybe they're not there, he feels emboldened to be able to tell this story. And he narrates his experience of coming to embody an authentic self and to find a label that aligns his inner experience of gender with this embodiment. One thing I should mention is that Danny is from a very conservative rural community in the Central Valley. He's not from Berkeley or Santa Cruz or something like that, or San Jose. He doesn't have necessarily all the safety we would expect. But when I ask him about how does he feel so emboldened to identify this way, this was one of my big surprises in this research, was that I was just as likely to find young people, members of Gen Z, who are comfortable with these kinds of stories in more conservative parts of the state than I was in more progressive ones. And his answer was simple: online. I've got a whole community online. So social technologies represent key sites in which individuals have played with constructions of gender this century. Here's like a little excerpt from Tumblr. And then also, while Tumblr was a key site in the 2010s, TikTok has emerged more recently with tools like the gender swap filter, just as an example. Now, my colleagues and I in the Sexual and Gender Diversity Lab at UC Santa Cruz have identified generational and intersectional patterns in the experience of people who identify as genderqueer or non-binary. So while we find that people of all generations have to navigate what we call like the unintelligibility of non-binary gender, this is unintelligibility meaning like most people don't get it, we have to do a lot of educating, right? Most people just don't get it. The culture is still binary. So while we find that it doesn't matter, all generations talk about this struggle, but we find that older generations of genderqueer people, that they are more likely to narrate challenges in their identity development process. They talk about not having access to this way of thinking when they were younger, which is really challenging. And sometimes they talk about it's really hard to go into these spaces and everyone else is a lot younger. That's a common story for older non-binary people. And we also find that millennials are more likely to think intersectionally about identities and queer politics, meaning that they don't think about gender and sexuality in a singular way, but rather in combination with other social identities that confer relative power or privilege. So they've kind of grown up with intersectionality as a way of thinking. And so we find that although everyone has been exposed to this story of gender as self-made in the 21st century, experiences are definitely shaped by the age at which they are engaging with this story. Okay, the second big story is about sexuality, and I've kind of lumped a few ideas about sexuality together. The notion that sexuality can be plural, it could be playful, it could be flexible, it could be fluid, plural in the sense that we recognize the capacity for attraction to multiple genders with the heightened visibility of bisexuality this century. And we recognize that attraction can occur regardless of gender and to people whose genders are beyond historic man-woman binary. Playful in the sense that we recognize the agency we have to play with power and roles and to be socially creative with sex and intimacy through kink. I wasn't planning to do this, but I will just plug it now because, I don't get any royalties from this. If you want to see a really good kink representation, Love and Leashes. It's on Netflix. The best kink representation I've ever seen. The more recent movie, Pillion, don't recommend it. I mean, I recommend people see these representations, right? But you have to think this is not the best representation necessarily, because central to kink is consent and communication, and all parties are thinking in a really informed way about power and role play. So sexuality can be plural, it can be playful with kink visibility, kink destigmatization, and flexible and fluid in the sense that we recognize that desires and identities exist on a spectrum and can shift over time and across different contexts. So desires and identities are not necessarily static or binary, as was conceived in the prior centuries, more rigid understanding of sexual orientation. The social technologies have facilitated the rise in visibility and community building among those who identify with identities such as bisexual and pansexual. Hashtags, I know, we live in a world of hashtags, but it hasn't always been that way. So believe it or not, hashtags are a 21st century invention. So that has really provided us with that opportunity. The opportunity for posts like this one about pansexuality, kind of sharing information about like what pansexual is, how it might be different from bisexual. And research conducted with those who identified as pansexual, such as Sue, has actually consistently revealed the central role of Tumblr, in particular as a site in which language about plural sexuality was widely circulated and discussed in the 2010s. Believe it or not, there's a lot of research on this, that Tumblr, of all sites, really was the spot. Not so much anymore, but it really was. So it's an important historic observation. Now, in the case of kink, social networks have helped to destigmatize kink, offer spaces to promote safe and responsible practices, build community, create new subcultures. FetLife is one example of this kind of social network, but kink communities have also thrived on sites like Tumblr, Instagram, and X, formerly Twitter. My most recent research on kink has examined the social and psychological participation in the pup subculture, which consists primarily of younger queer men who engage in metaphoric canine role play to explore new identities and lighter power dynamics within relationships. I won't ask for a show of hands of who went to Folsom Street Fair last year, but it's not that far away. Okay, you can go. In this international qualitative study of over 500 members of the subculture, we found evidence that participation provided distinct social and psychological benefits. This included stress relief, relaxation, and pleasure associated with entering the headspace of a non-human role, as well as benefits of identity exploration, community building, and social creativity. People in the subculture take on a new name as part of their identity development. They associate metaphorically with the breed of a dog. By the way, they disavow bestiality. This is not about bestiality, just to make clear. It's about role play, metaphoric role play, and engaging, kind of like reducing that human, high pressure kind of side of yourself and just having some fun. Most people in the subculture are canine lovers, though, in terms of having dogs, so that's worth noting. And we discovered that social technologies are central to the discovery and destigmatization of the subculture. And in particular, participants in the study talked about Instagram and Twitter, just to note certain platforms. The final component of this second big story, I tried to number the stories, so story 2, we're still on story 2, but the flexible and fluid component. So the final component is really that our sexual identities are not static, nor inherently binary. So like these 3 scholarly books have highlighted the rise of sexual fluidity and mostly straight identities this century. There's been a huge uptick in identification as mostly straight, just to recognize that sexuality is a spectrum. And I mentioned Craigslist personals. Again, kind of like with the Tumblr thing, if you look at the research on mostly straight and heteroflexible identities, most of these people are found themselves, past tense, through Craigslist personals, at least that older research. Where they're finding each other now, researchers are still kind of trying to figure that out, but the ideas are out there of heteroflexibility, homoflexibility, the idea that sexuality may indeed be a spectrum. Okay, the third big story of our century is that we now recognize that both sexuality itself and monogamy are not necessarily inherent to human nature, but rather they might be cultural imperatives or, compulsions, as I've called them here. So we recognize now that sexual desire occurs along a spectrum, and not everyone experiences the same amount of desire. We recognize that little to no sexual desire actually reflects the diversity of human capacity rather than some underlying pathology. We recognize that monogamy, here's a spoiler alert for you, monogamy is a cultural idea, and it has a history that's actually tied to economic and social orders. And finally, we recognize that consensual non-monogamies, such as polyamory and open relationships, constitute forms of intimate diversity rather than deviations from morality or healthy relationships. So in a 2019 article, my colleagues and I articulated a new paradigm for the study of relationship for diversity in the 21st century. We argue that relationship science has been historically contaminated by normative assumptions about such forms of intimacy as heterosexuality and monogamy, and infused with assumptions of what we call allonormativity, which is the ideology that to be human is to be inherently sexual. So that's kind of the sort of anti-asexual normativity. A queer paradigm reorients the field toward a recognition of diversity in intimate relationships by challenging these assumptions and recognizing that people can form meaningful intimate relationships irrespective of their level of sexual desire or their participation in the cultural institution of monogamy. In the case of asexuality, social technology has been widely credited for the shift in cultural view of asexuality as pathology to minoritize sexual identity and community. This website, asexuality.org, was actually established in 2001 by a college student. Yay, college students, see? Amazing. A college student named David J. created the website, and so he founded what is now called AVEN, the Asexual Visibility and Education Network. This site actually became a vital social network for people on what we now call the ace spectrum. And it's very interesting that a lot of the language on the ace spectrum, like for example, gray sexual and demisexual, they actually emerged in online message forums on the website in the first decade. Like if you do some digging around and you see, well, where did these words come from? They come from these online. This is my point about like, if you don't encounter the word that matches your inner sense of experiences, you're gonna find a way to make it up. So gray sexual, well, I have a next slide, I kind of show you the spectrum. This was an international study of almost 10,000 people conducted by my colleague Dan Kopolsky and myself, to almost 10,000 people who identified with different ace spectrum identities. And we provided some of the first evidence for distinct patterns of attraction and behavior on the ace spectrum. And this work actually appeared long after people were using these terms, but there was some kind of view that like, oh, are people really using these labels? Or are these just like internet identities, like kind of that delegitimizing kind of perspective. And so Dan and I wanted to actually look at this large international sample. We kind of viewed it as a form of scientific activism. This is important to represent the voices of people who are having these experiences. And in fact, we found these are real. The profiles are different among these different identities, profiles in desire, behavior, and identity. And they reflect the lived experience of thousands and thousands of people globally. Now, research on consensual non-monogamies has exploded this century, with studies using nationally representative samples finding that more than 1 in 5 Americans have ever been in a consensually non-monogamous relationship, and 5% currently live in such relationship. And I just saw a New York Times article yesterday about how there's actually legislation that has now passed in Pacific Northwest and the East Coast protecting polyamorous relationships. So it's kind of interesting, I think a lot of us who do this work and are living in kind of queer worlds and queer communities are feeling this sense of anxiety and encroachment, and yet there's things happening still, right, that are recognizing sexual and gender diversity. So it's good to acknowledge those moments. Now, in the case of consensual non-monogamies, once again, social technologies have operated in this way kind of similar to kink, where they've provided opportunities to destigmatize, share information about practices, promote safety and ethics. This is really important for both kink and polyamory, and to build identities and communities. And Reddit in particular is a really good and useful resource. And then actually Facebook groups. I know Facebook's a little bit kind of out these days, but there's still Facebook groups, there's still a thing. So there's some value there, some utility. So that's story 3. Let me get to story 4. Now, I've already alluded to intersectionality, and my work is really informed by intersectional thinking. But intersectionality has gone mainstream, basically, in the sense that, we really think about intersectionality. We recognize the individual inhabits multiple identities that accord relative privilege and power. And so we can't really talk about a uniform experience of gender and sexual diversity as a result. The specific configuration of identities always has implications for social and psychological experience. And people don't usually talk about generations in an intersectional framework, but I think it belongs there. I think certain points in the life course, people are considered to have, and often do have, more power. So I've also built that into my framework. But shocker again, it turns out social technologies have played a role in helping intersectionality to become more and more visible. So, the concept was really coming from 1980s, 1990s academic and social movement circles, but as we can see from this one Tumblr post, a fun guide towards intersectionality, and the hashtag Say Her Name movement, which was a form of Twitter activism, or as the title of this article, intersectional social media activism. And if you're not familiar with this particular movement, it drew attention to the experience of Black, cisgender, and transgender women who were exposed to police violence. Now, intersectionality is not some abstract concept, it's part of lived experience, and one clear example is our engagement on dating and hookup apps. So, in a study that I and my colleagues conducted with millennial queer men, we found that apps like Grindr were sites at which intersectional identities were primed, particularly with regard to race. As this screenshot from a Grindr profile reveals, sexual racism has thrived online, and queer people of color have to narrate this particular challenge as a result. And to be fair to Grindr, they've done a lot to try to reduce this, but I can't say it's gone. So far, the big stories that I've shared are all fundamentally supportive of sexual and gender diversity and more expansive thinking about identities. But as the timeline suggested, the story of our century has not been universally supportive. And the same cultural conditions that facilitated these four narratives, these four more kind of supportive narratives, have also facilitated a fifth hostile narrative. And this is a reactionary narrative. I've included it here because its ascendance has been part of this era of authenticity. And its contents are also characterized by a conviction that I am aligning my inner experience with outward expression. In this case, it's a kind of interpersonal ideology about gender. And I feel it, and I should be able to say it, just like you're able to say that you're non-binary, or you're queer, or you're trans, etc. So the story of conservative masculinity involves a return to hierarchical exclusionary thinking about gender and sexuality. It's a narrative that rejects diversity in favor of a social order in which cisgender, white, heterosexual men are firmly at the top, and the culture revolves around their desires. And we see this narrative in online communities collectively called the manosphere, which promote misogyny and violence against women, as well as in social and political movements such as Proud Boys and MAGA movement. And, when I first started kind of speaking about this, maybe like 4 years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, this still felt a little fringy, but with the re-election of Trump, I have a different kind of take on this now, and I'll come back to it in a little bit later. So the tradwife phenomenon, which I briefly referenced earlier, is directly linked to this reprise of conservative masculinity and has been amplified by social media influencers on TikTok especially. Now, closely related to conservative masculinity is the story of cissexism, the repudiation of this expansive view of gender we've seen this century. So those who support this narrative have been increasingly emboldened with the rise of conservative social media and the re-election of Donald Trump. The administration has explicitly sought to harm transgender and non-binary people by denying their existence and eliminating or limiting their access to affirmative resources. And so we've seen a major uptick this decade in explicit denigration of sexual and gender diversity online, as these posts reflect. The sixth and final story I'll highlight today flows directly from the fifth. It's the story of enduring stigma and its mental health consequences in the 21st century. My colleagues and I initiated the Generations study in 2014, which was a large federally funded study of the life and health of sexual minority people in a changing society. I can assure you this study would not get funded today, but it did then. We were hopeful at the time that the momentum toward marriage equality and the more expansive thinking about sexuality and gender we were starting to see would result in better health and mental health outcomes. Unfortunately, our hopes did not materialize in the data. This was a nationally representative sample, by the way, I should say. We worked with Gallup to obtain it. Across the birth cohorts we studied, we found similar levels of prejudice and stress, and similarly negative mental health outcomes. In fact, we found that psychological distress and suicidal behavior were worse for millennials than for older cohorts. So we came to recognize that enhanced visibility might in fact yield more vulnerability, and that we have to understand processes of greater authenticity and identity development as not necessarily associated with enhanced mental health in a society that continues to stigmatize sexual and gender diversity. And this publication comes from 2021, so as you can imagine, it's only gotten probably worse the past few years. Now, in a separate study focused on members of Gen Z living in both, this is the study that Danny's narrative was from, we conducted a survey as well. And these were members of Gen Z living in both supportive and hostile communities. I and my colleagues discovered high rates of prejudice and discrimination based on sexual and gender diversity. And most concerning, we found very high levels of depressive symptoms compared with a general sample of California teens. Living in a more supportive part of the state, such as the Bay Area, did not make a difference in mental health outcome. And believe me, these were very well-resourced areas compared to the more conservative areas. It did not make a difference. So I think that really, for us, it really spoke to the power of enduring stigma in the society. So I've suggested that the 21st century has been a time of radical authenticity in gender and sexuality, and I've highlighted the underlying stories that both support and denigrate diversity. It's only 2026, right? So there's a lot more time in this century to go. I'm going to share the big questions that I'm wrestling with and some directions I plan to pursue. So the big question for me is whether opportunities to construct personal narratives of authenticity are actually going to endure. So with the rise in views of social media as a source of anxiety and toxicity, rather than the more liberating view I've presented here, will opportunities for radical authenticity be curtailed? Or is the story I've told about the role of social technologies to promote new and expansive ways of thinking about gender and sexuality simply the story of a particular historical moment, the 2010s, It's a very influential paper to me on the idea of social psychology as history. Are we really mostly historians, social documentarians, and is that really what this work has been? Maybe, How will the rise of AI as the next big cultural tool impact this process? Who or what precisely has authority in the era of AI? I've suggested that traditional sources of authority were upended with the rise in social media that allowed individuals to connect directly with one another, rethink the meaning of gender and sexuality together with peers. If people are increasingly turning to machines as knowledge sources, and the information that those machines produce is their new source of authority, what is the impact going to be on personal narratives and cultural narratives of gender and sexual diversity? How will the mainstreaming of radical exclusion through such ideologies as conservative masculinity and cis-sexism alter narrative possibilities? As I suggested a few slides ago, this is not a fringe movement. The manosphere has gone mainstream. What will the impact be? I've talked about generations. Gen Alpha is actually like entering adolescence right now as we speak, with this next wave of change in social technologies, and at a time of heightened, emboldened exclusion. What will their narratives look like? Will they be like these Gen Z stories or not? You know, this is, as we say in science, an empirical question. Alternatively, might we continue along the trajectory of expansive language to describe gender and sexual identity? This is a graphic from a course I recently taught of 150 students at UC Santa Cruz. Admittedly a selective sample, I know that. But I think, you know, it's encouraging that we're seeing lots of this language still being used by members of Gen Z today. Maybe even more encouraging to me, at the national level, identification with any form of sexual and gender diversity continues to rise, as this figure indicates. The number, this is from Gallup, so this is nationally representative data. The number has tripled since 2012. You know, we're at 9% of the general population. And even more exciting, almost a quarter of Gen Z, identifies with some form of gender or sexual diversity. By the way, almost 60% of people who identify with some kind of sexual diversity identify as bisexual. So, yay for bisexual pride. And then I mentioned mostly straight. You know, the idea of exclusive heterosexuality is kind of destabilizing, with the growth, a number of people are saying, you know, actually I'm kind of heteroflexible, you know. Actually, I'm mostly straight. So we're seeing increasing evidence of this. And so will this continue? Will this continue? Now, all of this, for me, is kind of calling the question, you know, if we keep going in this direction, of whether a paradigm that focuses on forms of sexual and gender diversity as manifestation of minority identities will actually remain the appropriate paradigm for our century. Personally, I've increasingly come to recognize that the ever-expanding acronym relies on the logics of minority identity, which is rooted in a pathology paradigm of 19th and 20th century sexual science, which is itself anchored in the logics of hierarchical thinking associated with white supremacy and eugenics. It's forever destined to exclude. I'm not comfortable with the plus sign. You know, there's so many forms of expression that are just like not captured there. What is that? Where does that leave us? And you might say, wait a second. What if we considered sexual and gender diversity as a much broader phenomenon that included like any departure from normative conceptions? That would include mostly straight people, by the way. So in my own teaching and writing, I'm moving away from reliance on this like ever exclusionary acronym, highlighting distinct types of persons. This typology came from a pathologizing era, toward a framing of sexual and gender diversity as phenomena that's out there in the world, you know, diverse expressions of gender, diverse expressions of sexuality, departures from monogamy. So I think this opens up the discourse to a much broader range of sexual and gender expressions. I want the queer umbrella to be even more inclusive than it is now. And identities do matter. Identities do matter. I'm not saying they don't matter. I think a critique of the underlying logic of minority identities has to be balanced with a recognition of the value of identity for social organization, mobilization, and personal meaning-making. So this is the challenge, I think, sort of to recognize both the limitless possibility of sexual and gender diversity while honoring the experience of those who hold various identities and find a sense of meaning, purpose, and community in them. Just a couple of acknowledgments. My collaborator, Dr. Adriana Monago, was very central to developing many of the ideas in this talk. I've had a number of collaborators in this work since 2013. I've had some great funding, not anymore. I'm okay with that. We're gonna do the work regardless. And I've got wonderful students and colleagues in the Sexual and Gender Diversity Lab. I also did recently update my website, so I thought I should actually plug it and say, like, you could go there and get access to the publications and various things. So I'll end with that. Thank you so much for inviting me. This has been great.
Thank you, Dr. Hammack. So we do have a few minutes for questions, and I could just go around passing the mic for anyone that has any questions.
Hello, my name is Ashley, by the way.
Hi, Ashley.
My question is, how would you combat the comments made by the group that you mentioned often, like conservatives that grew up in a time of the boomer generation that say that term wasn't around when I was like young?
Right.
Why do people, like, it comes up now, people assume they identify with it, kind of naysayers, illegitimizing.
Yeah. Well, I would say that the limitations that we had to language and like who had the authority to make language was actually obscuring a diversity that has always been there. I think there's a long historical record of diversity in sexual attraction, sexual behavior, and gender identity, gender expression, and that the language was constraining it until we had the internet, until we had social media to open up the space. And so fundamentally, like, if you oppose, what I would say is, if you oppose the idea of these new, more expansive ways of describing gender and sexuality, you're really opposing people's real experience that just couldn't be named in a prior time because of the way language was more tightly controlled by sources of authority. Maybe that sound, I don't know if that would come, it's hard to know when you talk. By the way, I should say I don't spend a lot of time talking to audiences that are hostile towards sexual and gender diversity, and that is a choice. That is a choice. I am not interested in microaggressions and harm personally, and so I think in some ways to have a conversation, with people who are supportive or who are at least in settings where we can have discussions that are informed, like this, is my priority. So I don't know that my answer would be well received or even fully understood by them, but it would be something like that. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Thank you. Sorry. The lecture was really good, but this might not be a great question, but I was thinking about what you said about how your example of the person Sue, she was pansexual, and she made it a point about not constricting the people she is like sexually attracted to, like not having them being confined by the gender binary norm.
Right.
So I was wondering, like, to what extent is like someone being bisexual less progressive than being pansexual, or if that even matters?
That's a great question. I'm sorry I should have actually kind of qualified that, which is that, and this was actually a specific historical moment in the 2010s. Some people call it the bi-pan internet wars. So there was a little bit of debate about, like, well, if you say bisexual, are you reinforcing the gender binary? And that's like less progressive, right? Which is your point. And actually, a lot of people did research on this following that, like in the late 2010s and early 2020s, and found that actually people who identify as bisexual are not saying that they're only attracted to two binary genders. They're saying they're attracted to a range of genders, sometimes equally just as likely to be attracted to non-binary or et cetera. And so that's not the reason that, so in other words, like that kind of theory was sort of, in a way, kind of debunked. But rather people are often saying bisexual because they haven't been exposed maybe to pansexual, or, and actually this is more common, because they think bisexual is more intelligible out there in the world, right? So they don't have to like explain themselves every time to like, what it means. Like people who say pansexual are constantly having to kind of explain, no, I'm not attracted to pans, you know, like it's, I mean, you know, I'm kind of joking, but it's, you know, yeah, so great question, yeah.
See, I think I saw a hand over there somewhere. Thank you.
I think you spoke a little bit about the oppression of queer language and queer literature. So if you're actually like looking for examples of queer literature or queer language, how might you look for something like that? Or if you have any examples of queer, I don't know, plays or poetry or something like that?
Oh, that's a great question. Wow. Gosh. I think the best thing is to find yourself to a queer bookstore. Like go to the, I mean, there must be one around here too, right? But I was gonna say go to the Castro or something like that. But I mean, you know, obviously you can try to navigate online resources to find that kind of work. But when I was coming out in my teenage years in Washington, D.C., yeah, we went to the queer bookstore and I was like, oh my God, like I didn't know that there was so much queer literature and queer, you know, you just, it's yeah, so I don't want to recommend going to Amazon. Is that okay? Don't go to Amazon. But, you know, yeah, that's, or take a class, right? Queer studies and humanities kind of class. Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah.
Hi, I have a question for you.
Hi.
This is the first time that I've ever heard somebody talk about people might not being okay with the plus term,
Yeah.
and maybe like LGBTQ plus
Yeah,
might not
yeah,
be
Yeah.
the most inclusive and
Right.
could actually inadvertently be kind of cutting people out of the
Yeah,
group.
Exactly.
So I'm wondering if, I'm thinking of Lisa Diamond's works with sexual fluidity.
Mhm.
So if, and this is something that I've always wondered, but never have had the courage to dare talk to her at a conference, so
Mhm,
I appreciate you taking this question.
Yeah.
If it's fluid or a spectrum, would, so for her, like straight people, or for gender, like cisgender people, be included? And if so, would that kind of either help or hinder kind of the acceptance of this? And
Right.
then how might ideologies like cisgenderism and
Yeah.
kind of like larger ideologies that they may hold
Yeah.
kind of hinder people kind of getting on board with a more inclusive term if they're included in that term?
Right. Exactly. Well, yeah, thank you for the question. And I will say that I think that this is only something I've been speaking about really recently. And usually when I speak to audiences, it is really new. It's a new idea because it's like, well, everything you're presenting is like really focused on identities, right? But now wait, you're saying at the end that maybe identities might actually be somehow exclusionary, is the idea, right? And so from my perspective, and this is where I really think about like a paradigm like queer theory, that like what queer theory is really all about is challenging normative, like prescribed conceptions of how we're supposed to be in the world around gender, sexuality, how we're supposed to identify and how we're supposed to live, you know, within whatever those cultural expectations are. And so it's really about kind of freedom and liberation. And the problem with the acronym is that, yeah, it's like inherently, again, the plus sign is intended to signify, oh, and there's more. And there's more. But still, these ones get the priority in the acronym. So that's what I mean by this kind of these kind of hierarchical logics, right? And why is L and G, I mean, I understand historically why L and G start when we say that actually bisexual people constitute the vast majority of, you know, this. So it's, yeah, so what I mean when I say like sexual fluidity is a great example, that sexual fluidity is a phenomenon. It's a phenomenon. You might identify as straight at one moment, and then you're identifying as bi at another. That's the phenomenon, you know, that's under. So I would include a straight identity within a study and a recognition of that phenomenon. And then once we do that, we see actually a lot more people are queer. When you think about queer as like a broad, right? Because these narrow, rigid categories and binaries were never real to begin with. Sorry if that's like too crazy, but that's where I'm at.
So this will be like the last question, but I think our speaker might have a few minutes after.
Yeah, I can hang out for a little bit.
Hi, my name is Andrea. So on that response that you just gave, I know like communities is super huge for the queer community, like the gay community, the lesbian community. So with that like idea that you're proposing where we see like more people are queer because the spectrum is bigger,
Yeah.
what does that mean for communities? That they'll like be more specified or that they'll become more vague?
I think that's, you know, I think that to the extent that we have stigma and oppression that are really organized around certain things, like let's just say same-sex behavior or something, right? You're going to always see communities form, and you're always going to have minoritization as a process, you know? So we would have to, you know, get rid of stigma and oppression completely, and we'd have to get rid of heteronormativity completely. I don't think that's going to happen, right? But all I'm trying to say is that if we shift the lens from minority people to broader phenomenon, we'll see that these minority people aren't so strange. Like that's kind of what, right? And so that might end up reducing stigma. We're always going to want and need those communities, I think especially around sexuality and gender, because we want to be able to find like-minded others, you know? Great question.